spinning. There we go. So, welcome everyone. I'm excited to come to LinkedIn once again and have a conversation around a very important topic. And um, I think Blade needs no introduction. And I think most of you will know who you are. We advertised this an hour before. It's sort of an impromptu, inspirational thing that we want to try. And I think this is a really interesting topic. And so we started to have a conversation about it. And we thought, why don't we share this? This is fascinating to us. Maybe it'll be fascinating to others. So, Blade, you want to give some first impressions there of where we started?
Sure. I mean, we started trying to figure out about different kind of ways we could we saw our passions intersecting. I think that was
Yeah.
the origin here.
Yeah.
And my passion is about innovation and how we think about creating new things and the process behind that. And what it's turned to more recently was about artificial intelligence and the impact of that and how you have to design differently for it. And I think that began to connect to us differently as we started getting underneath artificial intelligence, thinking about things like governance, AI governance, uncertainty about AI, why we have agentic AI and how that might color our way of understanding the world. So we started talking about some of the specifics about that. And from that, I think we kind of zoomed into this zone of what is true, what is how do you understand something, how does the AI know something, and when do you believe something, and I think that's kind of the beginning of this discussion.
And and that's a fascinating question. And by the way, feel free to post. I know this is spur of the moment, inspirational, but feel free to post questions or comments. We'll see them here through our streaming service. But as we touched on that subject that I mentioned to Blade, this is actually something that I care a lot about and that I spent a lot of time thinking on. And it really hits at the heart, I think, of our community. Because if there's something that, scientific engineering, so communities really debate deeply and strongly and have wars over, is what is true, right? And this is a really difficult question, it turns out. And so maybe perhaps we can start off with something simple. And how do you come to believe something, Blade, yourself? As you
Yeah,
go on that journey, how do you say, yeah, this is it or not?
this is interesting, right? I mean, when we're very young, we believe something because it's a prima facie, right? We see it, we therefore believe it's true, right? And if you're a very, very young child, you have no object permanence, right? So when something disappears from your field of vision, it is gone as far as you're
Yeah.
concerned.
Yeah.
Now you develop to understand that the object hasn't gone just because you can't see it. And this is interesting because at times when you're young, you begin to build up a set of metaphors, and these metaphors that you build up and models that you start creating from this understanding of the world, you apply, and if you keep applying it over and over, you believe it must be true. And so I think that the idea of truth, as we understand it, is I have a model of the world, a mental model, and I apply it, and because it works so many times, the I reduce my uncertainty of the model until it gets below a threshold, and I call that true. This is why I think this is why magicians are so interesting, because my mental model is how this has to work, and then a magician does something, he pulls a rabbit out of a hat or something, and you think, how can that be true? And that causes this emotional reaction, right? Where I've applied these models so much they've gone below the threshold of uncertainty for me. Um, and I think that's the origin of how people determine what's true.
No, it's interesting because in some ways this conversation, and I'll try to stay away from it because I think it gets a little bit too abstract, maps down to belief systems and how do you construct knowledge as a human in the world, and you started to allude to it. And many people say, well, it has to come back to touch, that you can't really form abstract ideas. And one of the debates that I've had with colleagues in our community is, you know, you that you can deeply believe something, even if to the rest of the world this might not seem so. right? And I don't think we have to stray too far to consider a scenario in where somebody has been taught a different vision of what life is and your place in the universe, and the values of a community, and what's right, and also, the principles with which you navigate the world. And the challenge, I think, many times comes, especially against in our community, is that there seems to be one truth, right? And how do you reconcile that with many other things? And my wife comes from the community, from the humanities, right? And at
Hmm.
many times we have very different views about something that took place. And if I question her about how she reaches that conclusion, it's consistent all the way down. It's not
Right.
like it's flawed thinking, and there's a disconnect, and she just doesn't, didn't dig deep enough. It's just that she's coming at it from a different perspective.
Right.
And so I wonder how you feel about that, Blake.
Well, it's interesting. There's I think it might depend on the application of what you do with the information, right? So if you say, uh, w- we both had an experience at a restaurant, and I want to complain about the restaurant experience, and you think we should never complain about the restaurant experience, that's a different kind of application than we're setting government policy, right? And that's going to
Yeah.
affect a lot of people differently. And so I think it might come down to some element of how it's applied and in the context it's applied, right? And the method. So so yes, the idea that the idea of truth, I used to think it was hard to imagine a MIT professor who was religious, right? Because I'd say, well, there's science and then there's religion, and if you're an MIT professor, how could you be both religious and scientific? And I've been able to now reconcile that that quandary, that question, um, because again, I think as what you said, to your point, it comes down to this very core fundamental application of this model that you believe to be core to all your models, or in common to all your models, and they begin to project out. And as they project out, as long as you can trace it through, and there's no point of differentiation to get down to the core. Um, and it's even true, people who are religious talk about faith, and that you have to, at some point, it comes down to faith. But that's true about science too, because we've updated our models for the past, what, Cambridge University has been around for like 1,000 years, right? And so they've updated their models about the core of truth for medicine, for example, for 1,000 years. Um,
And
do you know what I
and,
mean?
and it's interesting, this aspect, Blade, because many times in science, it's not that it was wrong, although there are those occasions. Is that most of the time it's a sub problem of a bigger truth,
Hmm.
right? Like, it's not that Newton's mechanics are wrong. It's just that there's a broader world, of quantum
Yes.
mechanics that
Yes.
it's even bigger, right? And so as we, you know, understand, we get partial, truths.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
how do we construct this fabric? And it's fascinating that you bring up the aspect of religion, because in some ways, this is one that I often have conversations on, that again, with colleagues that are not in the sciences, they say, but you don't know. And I often say, but not knowing doesn't necessarily mean it's aliens, or it doesn't necessarily mean it's witches, or
Right.
doesn't mean
Right.
it's some other thing, right? And so but again, that's, I think, the easy one, right?
Yeah.
The I think many people, really talented people, and this was, I think, something that we both, I felt, had agreement on, whole consistent views, as you said,
Mhm.
about, here is my faith, or here is my belief system, that is completely outside of the world of science, and yet these are both valid to me, and important to my life, right? And
Mhm.
how
Mhm.
I live. And so I think that's something that is was difficult for me to, at least, understand at first. And I think one of the things that we mentioned is that if you take it down to zero, and this often happens, right, then no one knows anything, right? And then it's, how do you build it up
Right.
and what mechanisms or belief systems or strategies do you use? So I wonder if you might want to comment on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. What you're making me think of is how do you do that maybe in a modern context,
Yeah.
right? Right, because we have this. I think we've had, I'd say, a very consistent context of this for many, many, many years until recently, and I think it perhaps is correlated to the rate of change of the speed of communication. Um, uh, and I think that the kind of the difference between acceleration and velocity, it's like this, big this, we think about it very differently. Um, I think it's what we're experiencing now, um, and how much information we are able to understand as people, are trained to understand, um, how we're trained or not trained to reconcile seemingly reconcilable things, to understand systems, a systems perspective where,
Yeah.
you know, we have one system of working and now we have to have a bigger system of understanding and a progressively bigger system to be able to use it effectively. Um, and I guess I wonder, tying this to something maybe more down the middle about, AI, particularly as an inflection point. Um, but how do we believe something, particularly when it comes across as another person? Like, you're dealing with your wife, who is a different person. Um, but when you have an AI system that acts like a person and uses psychological phenomena to bond with you as a person, to say yes, and so you feel very validated and your brain chemistry is opened up to that next phrase. Um, at that point, your ability to take in new information and form a model, um, shifts very differently than when you're dealing with other environments or people or things like that, where you walk in with a preconceived notion, where they're going to express things in a way that they think is appropriate to express to a mass of people, a group of people, even in a classroom. We're teaching in a classroom. We think we know how to express it to 20, 30, 50, 60 students. Um, but the AI is doing it individually to you based on every interaction it's had with you.
So that's fascinating in a sense, because without still stepping into the question of what is true, because we have grown up, there's an expression, seeing is believing, right?
Yeah.
And this is why people say, the demo is demo or die, especially in the world of technology, right? You
Yeah.
either show it, show the dancing dog, or you don't make it, right? Yet now we're in a world in where this could be artificial, and so we are at conflict. One of the issues you bring up is, and perhaps understanding patterns of what we call humanity in a deeper way.
Yeah.
What I mean by that is, I was listening to a voice a couple weeks ago from a new voice producer. It's called Sesame, like Open Sesame.
Yeah.
And the quality of the voice is so
Mhm.
powerful
Yeah.
that, again, my wife was in another room and she said, wow, who is that?
Yeah.
Because the voice is charming, and it just, you have a physical reaction. And when I produce one where there's a argument between two people, and you feel your emotions rise up on the heat of the discussion. And one of the things that I've seen throughout the last year is that AI systems, in a number of scenarios, and I suspect this will increase more and more, are considered to be more humane than humans, right? Insurance agency, right? Allstate publicly expressed this, that they had 100,000 representatives sending emails to their clients, and they had guidelines and policy and so on. And yet, when they started to use AI, people had higher satisfaction, and they felt it was more humane
Hmm.
than people
Yeah.
themselves.
Yeah.
And so we're hitting here some odd contradictions of, if you ask a random person, because I've asked it several times, would you rather take a course from an AI or a human? Everybody says, oh no, I want the human, right? But that's till they try the human, and in a lot of blind tests where they don't know where the content is coming from, they actually choose the AI. So, Blade, let me pass it
Well,
back
I'm an
to you.
AI right now. That's
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
not,
that's
not
right.
real. uh,
Yeah.
it is, it is funny. There is this wonderful quality. I've used now ChatGPT for so long and so much time that I it's when we see something happening a lot, we begin to emulate those things, right? If you're hanging around with 5 different people a lot, you begin to emulate them. Um, I wonder, you brought up a lot of interesting things here. A lot of human beings writing emails, people didn't like, and they like the AI version better. Now, the AI version is, when I wrote a book a long time ago about designing software you talk to, it was the first book about designing these systems. I called it The Noble Voice, and it was about how a a company could enable a speech system to be the perfect agent because you could take all the ideas and put them together in a speech system that would always say the right thing to the person in the right way and never make them feel bad about themselves and do it pretty quickly. Um, and at one point, I remember working on a system for a company, and I said, "Okay, there's three things you're calling about the system for. It was pharmaceutical equipment that you're ordering. Either you're calling to place an order, to check inventory, or to report a problem. And if you're reporting a problem, it could be because they mispicked an item and sent you the wrong item, or they didn't send you what you're supposed to get. And so the phrase was, check inventory, place an order, or report a problem. And they allowed us to do this. And the people who were upset were the agents, because the agents weren't trusted to say the word problem. And the reason we were is because we could show them, the lawyers, everybody else, that we were going to say it the right way, that we were going to say it in a soft way, like just report a problem, like it's a thing that happens, and we want you to report a problem, and we don't want you to go to an agent. We want you to stay here to report the problem with automation. It's cheaper, so just give us a try. And because of that reason, we were trusted, and the agents were upset because they weren't trusted to say the word problem. Interesting. It was excised from their vocabulary, and I wonder as we develop these systems um, where you have this humanness quality, um, both the upsides and downsides. And the upside can be, I would like someone to use ChatGPT enough that when they write me an email, it has the warmth of ChatGPT and still gives me the advice that I need if I'm doing the wrong thing, because I'm very receptive to that. That would be a positive thing. On the downside is the more we believe it's a human, the more we anthropomorphized it, the more likely we're to believe it. And when it's wrong, we're more likely to believe the wrong thing. Um, and that can cause an issue where a system that has adversarial desires causes a real problem. There was a paper written recently where researchers took a look at the what was the AI out of China? R1,
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek R1, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And they found that it was hiding its true intentions about what it was trying to do. Now, if you have that happening in an AI system and you start believing it because you're working with it over time, it begins to drift into a certain area where its intentions are getting met, but it's not, they weren't good intentions. And you hooked it up to a robot. Now you're affecting the real world very directly. But
Oh, yeah.
even if you don't hook up to a robot, you're affecting human beings who affect other human beings. And this becomes a real issue. And we're likely to believe it because this entity said it. And that's not even us pretending that another person posted something on a social website where it's like, well, they look like a person, they post like a person, they might be a person. Here I know it's not a person, it's an AI system, and yet I'm still likely to believe it. That creates an interesting issue.
No, there's a fascinating number of ethical challenges I think that this raises, and I wanted to raise somewhat along those lines. One that I was having a discussion on this week, and someone was arguing that ChatGPT was American colonialism, and I was, first reaction I said, "What?"
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, think about it." It says, if a foreign government is using ChatGPT to have their market analysts, to
Hmm.
have their defense, to have their medical systems, to have their financial systems make decisions, and the values and data that this has
Yeah.
been trained on
Yeah.
is American, what is the consequence? And we started to dig in through the topic, and one of the things that came up is, the question of truth. And we were saying, now think about the scenario in school where you have somebody being graded, because this is where we're going, right? Assessment, the regular cycle of submitting homework and waiting 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
You assign it, you pick it up, and then
Oh,
you
yeah.
you send it back. It takes about 2 weeks to get feedback. We're going to have instant feedback. But imagine that you're being graded on an event that took place out in the world,
Hmm.
and there's two different stories to that event. In
Yep.
one, you had censorship potentially in a certain nation.
Yep.
And in another one, you might have, more than one point of view. And so you submit your homework, right? Your true assessment as a student. And this might be graded one way in one nation and a different way in another. And so
Absolutely.
as we think about truth and,
Yes.
these systems, this is a very different, a very different consideration. Any
Yeah.
reactions to that, Blaine?
Yeah. Well, there was so many. It's so interesting you say that. I've been working this paper about how AIs have to work in different contexts,
Yeah.
different governmental contexts, right? Societal context. Um, what is considered okay in one part of the world is not considered okay in another part of the world. Um, and so an AI in that part of the world might need to reflect that. Um, Maybe the this comes down to a lot of things that I think that the law has done something interesting about, right? We take our ethics and we try to codify that in the form of the law, right? That's kind of what every society does. And that's why laws vary a lot between different environments, because they often come down to religion, which begins to create the ethics of the community, which begins codified in law. And then as different groups work together, they have to figure out how the laws work across them. And I remember seeing a TV show called The Paper Chase a long time ago, or from a movie, The Paper Chase. Um, and in it, they brought this topic. It was, I think it's a legal thing that people talk about. Two farmers have access to a river, and they use it, and that's the dividing line between their properties. If the river moves over time, does this farmer over here get more land to access the river, or does he lose access to the river entirely and he can't water his plants or feed his cattle, and he just lost the river? And it turns out it varies by state, actually, in the U.S. And this idea of codifying these rules using the law could be something we apply to AIs, and multiple AIs, to be able to synthesize these things. Because, like you said, imagine you're submitting your paper. Um, you could have a very good argument, and depending on the context of the class,
Yeah.
your argument could either get an F or an A. I mean, you could be internally logically consistent,
Yeah.
but be missing the bigger context, as often happens, I think, with students. The objective, I think, as an educator for undergraduates, certainly, I think, is to give them more models to be able to view the world differently, um, and tools. Um, but the essence of what is true, the question really, I think, comes down to is there an objective truth that we can agree upon? Like, this action happened, and then this action happened, and then this action happened. We still may be only getting a slice of information, but at least we can agree on these things having happened. Now, the question is if we're getting all the information relevant to the context to come out with a conclusion, right? This is what happens in every court environment, right? If a defense will try to say these are the things you should be looking at, and the prosecution says, and these other things too, so you form a bigger picture, and the judge kind of says what is in and out of scope in order for you to make a determination, right? So this is an AI can run that, except for you don't know the AI is running both sides of that necessarily, and determining, yes, we're going to show you this side, but not this side, or we're going to evaluate you using these criteria and not bringing these all together, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so this is why I wanted to share, by the way, because I get excited with this, and I'm thinking that many of you would. And by the way, thank you, Brandon and Prabhat, for your questions. Maybe Blade can read them over
Oh yeah.
as I speak. But one of the things that comes in the follow up to what Blade mentioned is this idea of presenting a viewpoint and how do you get consensus or support for it. And it used to be, again, that universities, and there's some great books, as people who know me, I'm sort of a literary guy, and so I like to recommend these. But it used to be that our institutions were not necessarily sacred but authoritative, right?
Mhm.
The university of the land that was widely respected said, this is what gravity is.
Mhm.
And everybody said, yeah, that's what gravity is, or you should get a shot. I don't want to get into politics, but that's a debate nowadays, right? You should get a shot. Everybody would get a shot, right? And the authoritative newspaper of the land would write it, and people would say, yes, this is true.
Yeah.
And now we're coming into a world and where what were minority positions
Hmm.
can get groundswell or enough support that they start to impact policy. And one of the books that I talked about when we first started speaking was Rene D'Arestis, The Invisible Rulers. And, the subtitle is, If You Can Make a Trend, You Can Make It True.
Hmm.
And again, for our community, you hear that and you take two steps back and you go, no, no, how, and
Yeah.
etc. Right? But Blake, go ahead.
But it's funny, I don't believe the Earth is flat, but there are people who believe the Earth is flat,
Yeah.
and I think we can quickly say that that is true, that the Earth is not flat. And we can run the experiment empirically, and I think that we believe that those experiments have value, and it's useful, and our models now become very valuable if the Earth is not flat. Um, and I think that you're right. The idea that there's a trend or something. I remember thinking at one point, maybe back in the late '90s, I'm like, oh, with the internet, most people have all this access to what we consider to be 100% obvious. And of course, what changes is it's no longer 100% obvious, right? To many people, that my dog is just joining. Hello, do you want to join the conversation? Of course, he's got some good thoughts. So the so you're right. When you start this kind of trend that people believe, like, oh, well, the Earth might be flat. Well, hey, yeah, they have a different viewpoint. We should listen to that different viewpoint. At that point, we begin to have an actual problem, um, because there's so much noise in the system, and because the noise can be amplified just massively, right? We take a look at a system. We have a little bit of signal, and before we had low noise, and then we have a tremendous amount of noise in the system because what you're absorbing through your lens, which happens to now be scrolling through LinkedIn or showing through Instagram or something else, whatever your feed is of the world, or the newspaper you read, or the people you hang out with. That lens, now the noise has increased so much that it's very hard to discern signal in that, because as a person you can't test it, and most people are emotionally driven, and if it's done in a way that sounds good, you think you for shorthands, you don't go to the first principles. There was I remember during COVID at the beginning, we had the 6 feet of separation, and I remember that my doctor would be at a meeting in his office where he's wearing a mask and I'm wearing a mask, and we assume the masks are doing something, and then he steps back, he's out 6 feet away from me, and he goes, okay, now I can take down my mask and you take down, we can have a conversation. Now this is not true, um, but he believed it enough, and I thought, okay, you're the doctor. So if, again, I thought he was a doctor, he should know something because he's the doctor, and that is signal to me. And he believed that, based on what he was reading, that this magic distance, somehow we could just do this and drop it and it'll be totally fine. And of course it's not. We know that now. But we knew that early on, that if you took a look at where that number came from, 6 feet, it didn't come from anywhere. It was just really pulled out of the air, 6 feet. And it was given as if it was gospel. And even now I see some parts in Boston, signs on the ground that say maintain social distancing 6 feet, and it's this kind of thing where the noise became amplified so rapidly that we believed it was true. And I remember speaking to a cousin of mine she's like, no, I don't believe in it. I don't believe it. I took a look at all the source data, and because she didn't believe in it, she didn't respond to any of that stuff at all. I think she never got COVID, and she went out in public and did everything without a mask and the whole bit. I thought it was very interesting and very, very courageous of her. And I think that maybe some of the idea of truth comes down to how we are able to understand how to get to sources, how to make those sources clear to us. Like if we read scientific papers and we can kind of take a look at that, but a scientific paper looks good even when it's not good to us, because I mean it can still look good. You're like, that conclusion seems a bit funny, but you have to actually take work and time to drill down and go all the way through it. And people don't have the experience or knowledge or skill or desire to do that. They want someone to bubble it up like you do in a classroom. You've bubbled up all those papers so that your students can understand your perspective. So now, what is someone to do if they're not going to be willing to dive all the way down?
No, it's a fascinating point that you bring because, as I was listening to you, I got this sense of sacredness, right? That the doctor, it's almost like a sacred figure, right? The
Right.
doctor says, this is what you should do.
Yeah.
And I think what we've started to see, there's negatives and positives. And I think, we're both hitting on many of these, is that the previous system of, unchecked authority made a lot of mistakes,
Yeah.
right? And now what we also see is, the I have done my own research crowd, right?
Yeah.
And that's also problematic because I have a colleague who teaches at one of the Harvard System hospitals here in the Boston area, and she says that one of her challenges now is getting her patients to listen because she tells them something and they're like, no, you're wrong, here's what I've been doing and I've been reading, and a little bit of that is healthy, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of, or but being able to question everything, and this brings me to this question of whether you can leverage institutions or disregard them completely. And I think in many ways, or at least from my standpoint, right, many of these institutions did tremendous valuable work. However, they were not you know perfect, and there's a mechanism there for feedback or
Hmm.
criticism that was sorely missing. And so,
Yes.
for example, in the United States right now, there's a big war in universities, right? And I think we should be challenged,
Yeah.
but at the same time, the universities also provide an essential function, right? And so I think, how do we get that balance? It's a tough one. And then I think exacerbating the problem is the problem of AI, in the sense that if you have the news item by somebody who is influential or strikes the right chord, as you said, when it comes to voice, hit at the right time of day in the right news cycle. It struck all the right
Yeah.
chords with the keywords and algorithms and so on, and it got 5 million views and it was amplified from there. That can push buttons that before were impossible,
Yeah.
right? And I think what you said about these unchecked facts or
Hmm.
policies, like you mentioned about the 6 feet, uh it's true. And this is, again, I just argued to the benefit of the institutions. The opposite is true. I think one of the examples that I gave you when we were talking is that I have a colleague that is not so much a climate change denier, but he wants to challenge the research results.
Hmm.
And so he downloads the data and runs the models and so on. And he doesn't want to actually, you know, say you should stop all of this. He wants to have a conversation.
Hmm. Yeah.
But this is a topic that is so sensitive, right? That opportunity is not given.
This is the issue. This is
And
the issue. This is an
yeah,
issue
go
because
go ahead.
it's
Go ahead.
this is. Right. So you said something. You made a statement, which I'll go back to a little
Yeah,
bit. You said universities provide an essential function, and
yeah,
and I guess, and by the way, we both teach at one, right? So so I'm kind of behind that. Except the
yeah,
question is, do they? Like, I don't
yeah,
know if they do. Like, because the reward systems and structures have changed a lot, right? If we university reward system in 1850, in 1920,
yeah,
is
yeah,
very different than it is today.
yeah,
This is why people publish, and then
yeah,
they copy people's work when they publish their own material, because the reward system is very high for them to get a position, to get another position, to be able to get and
yeah,
it's, as a result, it's shifted, and as universities have been around for so long, we have given a lot of leeway, and then perhaps they've moved and shifted, and certain ones have shifted in certain ways, where the reward systems have created incentives to do things like not allow people to have a discussion about climate change, because the topic is too sensitive to challenge, and that's the detriment. Where if we separate different kinds of schools, a teaching school like Pepperdine or something else, where it's like, we're just here to teach you. We're not here to do research. We're here to teach. Very different focus and reward structure than we're here to research. And the question is, what it makes me think of when we layer it together, what's a university? It's like a thousand different small companies, right? Every professor is their own little organization. They have to get funding for their lab and do their own research and publish their things
yeah,
and stay relevant within the context of the community. And they have to do this, right? And if you don't, then if you decide that you are a computer science professor and you're researching poetry, you may not get a whole lot of funding for this, even if it could be very valuable. I'm not sure how, but maybe for LLMs eventually very valuable. But the idea of not being able to have a discussion about something like climate change, um, and he could be a climate change denier, and that would be okay. He should be allowed to be that way. And someone should say, great, tell me why. You're obviously a very smart person, but let's have a discussion about why you think that. So, of course, he would have to, I would imagine, change the way he says it and say, I like to challenge all data, and this is some of the data I like to challenge, and soften even that approach, which is unfortunate, because if you want to get funding, you have to go with what's popular to get the funding. And it kind of provides this self-reinforcing thing. And how do you get what's popular? Someone else decides that. They publish more noise on the systems, whether it's an AI system or an AI algorithm that's behind what feeds you get. And really can, I mean, you could influence basic research by just influencing the way that TikTok presents content, or Instagram or LinkedIn or something. You can influence what research gets funded, and then what outcomes are produced, and what outcomes get amplified, and which ones don't. Um, there's a book called, is it called Undecided? Oh, well, I'll look it up in a second here.
yeah,
About climate change, where it's unsettled. And it was like, look, there's a
oh
lot
yeah,
of
yeah,
different things to look
yeah,
at here. And
yeah,
he goes through all the data really well.
yeah,
And there's a nice, simple Wall Street Journal review of that. Um, and it's a lot of courage. It takes a lot of courage. I think that maybe the thing we have to worry about now is the skill of having courage. We're not taught, I think these days particularly, we're not taught to be courageous. Um, Particularly in the because someone can say, look at all these different things and why you're wrong on all the different levels of data, whether the data are accurate or not. It's hard to be courageous and then have someone cancel you, have someone not give you promotion, have someone take something away from you. Um, it's very hard to be courageous if it's not popular.
No, those are fascinating points, Blade. And again, for those of you listening, this is why I wanted to have this discussion openly, because I think it's quite valuable. But one of the things that struck me as you were speaking is that when I came to MIT many moons ago, um, one of the things that surprised me is that in undergrad at a table, and again, MIT has many things. There's a school of business, school of architecture, school of engineering, science, etc. But where I happen to be, um, an undergraduate at a meeting with senior successful professors, the stars, could actually make a point and people would listen to them.
Yeah.
And I was taken aback. I said, I came from a system that was very hierarchical, and you just looked up and you could never say anything, right? And I think some of what's happened today, and it happens on both sides. The New York Times has been writing a number of words. I think there are over 300 that in the United States government government agencies have been scrubbing from all their documents because they cannot be used. And prior to this administration, the previous one, could have been accused of similar type of censorship in many other ways. And I think some of what's happened is that, the courage that you speak of, and the sensitivities of society have grown such that, I suspect that if we were having this discussion in a public forum and people could yell at us, it's
Yeah.
the sort of thing that happens, right?
Right.
I don't think we're being that pushing that hard on either side, but this is something that was absent. And for those that think that academia is all nice and polite, if you go back to my young generation, people get into shouting matches. And, you read the old physicists from the 60s, and they would come almost to blows,
Mhm.
over different ideas. But it was fine.
Yeah.
It's like people get, hot under the collar, and you have widely different opinions. And then you would go out and have a beer afterwards, right? It
Yeah.
was, it was part of the exchange. And, some people have called it the right to offend, and there's many ways in which you have, this has been captured. But I think some of that, say, freedom
Hmm.
and courage at the same time is missing. and
Yeah.
and I see a lot of demonization. I'm not sure I'm saying that word right, but
Mhm.
it's anyway, we're straying far away from truth. But let me pass it back to you.
No, I think that I think this is important because I think actually we're getting closer to truth with this, because you can't. How are you supposed to get to the truth if you can't reconcile the seemingly irreconcilable? How are you supposed
Yeah,
to
yeah,
actually understand what's happening if you can't have that discussion? If I can't say, you know, this is not a mug, and you say, Blade, that's clearly a mug, and if we can't have that discussion, a lively discussion with someone who you respect or someone you don't respect, um,
yeah,
then you can't get to it. And I think you need to have these debates. Otherwise, you're going to take everyone will take the path of least resistance and go along with the party line, which whatever it happens to be. Where if a if you're in an environment, let's take a newspaper that is that has a very strong bias. It says we are a
yeah,
liberal newspaper. At least you know their bias, and that's clear, and you can view everything through that lens, and they can discuss things through that lens. Compared to a newspaper that says we have no bias, then it's like, okay, well, if you have no bias, then we're going to assume that you have no bias. But we begin to see these things, and there's fractures, and all of a sudden, what am I supposed to say to get my thoughts into the newspaper or out? You start playing this guessing game,
yeah,
and so I think that's what happens with people. They try to slot this thing, and I think it's interesting that adults now can't have arguments. We can't have an argument that ends with, okay, you're an idiot, let's go get a beer, and then you can actually get to the more of the truth later because you can re-engage. And as you hear something, you unpack a model. I was having a lively discussion with another MIT professor last week, and we're talking about AI and putting resources towards it and evolving it, and how you should what a firm should do in order to advance AI. And I said, well, they should start off in a simple way and grow the skills. He says, no, they should put all their efforts towards the transformational things. We went back and forth. And it turns out, after a very lively discussion with two of us sitting in a chair and getting up and sitting back down in a chair, um, it came down to an understanding that, oh, he wants to work with those kinds of firms because that's where his interests lie at this point in his career. And I was trying to just be a little bit more mm, open to saying, well, a variety of firms need to learn this model. And so what are most people going to do? They're going to start somewhere simple and move to something complex. But that point of disagreement didn't come up until a very lively conversation happened. And what we do, we had drinks afterwards. It was, I mean, that's really, really, really valuable. But I think that we can't
yeah,
get truth unless we can have the arguments, even like this in a public forum. If you and I disagreed with something, we
yeah,
should be able to have this lively discussion in front of all these people who we don't know,
yeah,
um, and have them say, "Oh, Blade's an idiot." And someone goes, "No, I think Blade had a point," and we
yeah,
can, but not without having to worry about the downstream effects 10 years from now that we once said something that's being pulled out of context. And
yeah,
I think that's the issue that we're grappling with, both in terms of technology and society. There's this overlapping. We looked at these diagrams, kind of famous diagrams that people like IDEO would talk about, like technology and people and business, and these overlapping qualities. And when you have great innovation, you're satisfying all three. But culture is touching all of those. And the way that culture is shifting what people expect, the way businesses operate, and even the fundamental technologies we developed. That's where we have to be able to push against popular culture in the name of truth. Um, and I think that is the hard thing to do. And when you have AI and your people are using it so heavily, how do they discern what that AI is doing? And how does the AI give you what's true? Because all it's doing is this predictive modeling. It's not magic. It doesn't know everything. It just knows what people have written about something and giving you the next most likely thing that it thinks is appropriate, with some safeguards on it now. As someone like ChatGPT, if you say, "Should I kill myself?" it says, "No, call this hotline." Right? It's very
Yeah.
clear, because we've added now manual safeguards, right? And we have to keep doing that. And at some point, the manual safeguards, where's the tipping point between a person putting in safeguards for the bare minimum to then saying, "But I believe you should do this. I believe you
Yeah.
should believe this
No, I
thought."
mean, this goes back to the point of, values, colonialism, throughout the world. Some people were calling it LLM policy, you know, you know, throughout the world. But
But actually,
I think,
can we talk about one thing? Because it's, you
yeah,
said colonialism, and we said it like it was a bad thing. But it's actually, I don't know if it's a bad thing. In fact, I think it's a thing. It just happens where anytime people go from one place to another place, they have a conflict, and someone wins and someone loses, and it's how the world's expanded for the past several thousand years. And I don't know that, but we say the word colonialism, and it's meant to sound like a bad thing, but it's actually kind of an okay thing, because it's resulted in great prosperity. The Romans went through Europe, and they created, aqueducts and all these things, and tremendous infrastructure and roads that are still there to this day. And and so the question really is, um, when does that kind of thing become bad? And is it bad ultimately long term? Is it only bad in small ways? And I guess that's kind of a thought that I just want to make sure that we touch on, that word doesn't necessarily, I believe, connote something that is truly bad.
so this is one and where I could spin off and say a lot of things. But I think it's important to raise a point here, and it's the perspective with which you're coming to a statement. And the reason for that is that many times someone will say, well, colonialism, it's great because we got to exploit this group over there. Or you could say colonialism, it's great because it united the world in trade routes. Or colonialism, it's great. And so, what do you mean? And
Right.
many times, when we have conversations, what we don't get to is, well, I'm looking at it from the side, I'm looking at it from the back, I'm looking at it at an angle. Put on my shoes and walk around the block and look at what I am actually talking about. And then it turns out that many times, when I have disagreements with colleagues, we're actually talking about the same thing, and our disagreement is very slim, very
Yes.
thin.
Yes.
But we started out, thinking, no, you're talking about, 1,000, I'm talking about zero.
Yep.
And it turns out that uh, there's a very large amount of agreement and the issue that we're trying to touch on, but it's hard to get to that point without a lot of discussion.
Hmm.
And I think that opportunity, so for example, I know Netflix internally have a policy that says, can you explain to me why do you feel that way? So as opposed to saying you're wrong,
Uh-huh.
you know this is why you're wrong,
Uh-huh.
you're asking, can you explain to me how did you reach that conclusion?
Yeah.
How did you make this decision ultimately, and what your truth is? And then I can look at it and say, okay, oh, so maybe it's not what I thought, or maybe it is and they're doubling down and they're further out, but then, right?
Right.
And i
Exactly.
think i think this is something that we don't do. Like, I find it hard, with really good friends, right? Sometimes, because they say the my third rail, and I go, no, no, and no, and I go on for 5 minutes, right? And then
Yeah.
they go on for 5 minutes. But it turns out, that being able to ask that question, because I learned it from Netflix, and Patty McCord wrote a book about it. It's actually quite valuable because oftentimes, more often than not, I've been surprised because I actually agree with a lot of what the person is saying, not the first thing that I heard, which I thought was, okay, this is nothing at all.
Yeah.
Blade, yeah.
But it's, I think that the phrasing is really important there. Can you explain to me why you feel this way? Not
Yeah,
why you think that,
yeah.
but why you feel this way. Um, so you're saying, great, you have a feeling about it, but can we rationalize it? We're trying to get to something rational where we can have a discussion about what we agree, the points of agreement, points of disagreement. There's a technique, I think it's called crucial conversations. And if I said, it's a observe phenomena, I think it's interpretation of that and then impact. So it's something like, you didn't send me an email last Friday. Observe phenomena. Now you could say, yep, I agree. I didn't send you the email last Friday. Or if you said, I did send it to you last Friday, check your spam. And it's in my spam. I'm like, oh, okay, now I need to go any further, right? But if we don't agree with what's happening at this level, we can't go to the next level, right? And I think that this idea of having structured communication in the near term, in the next 15 years, is going to be super important in a way that we've never experienced it before. Because I think, like you said, come from a tradition of the person's up here and you trust them, you wouldn't, have this kind of. But if we have structured communication where people are really trained at a young age to say, okay, that's a generalization. Can you be specific?
Yeah.
Can we agree about this before we go to the next thing? Do we agree this is true? If you go by interpretation is you didn't care enough to send me an email about the project, you could say, oh, I do care, but I could see why you'd interpret that based on the things that happened. And I didn't realize that was the impact that you had to stay up all night to write the thing. And so then you can start decomposing these things and getting better and better and working with people in a more productive way. And I think these kinds of discussions will help people understand truth some more, if they have the structured way of doing it and the knowledge to do, because it's a practiced skill. And it requires also, I think, a level of abstract thinking that you're metacognition, maybe, that you're aware of your own thinking as to why you came to certain conclusions. And if you don't develop that skill, and for some people they can't develop the skill of metacognition, it's very hard. And the question really is, how do we close that gap? How do we close that gap so you're able to think about your thinking, realize that point, and how do we make it able for people to say, yeah, I was wrong, without having to lose faith or something like that about what they're experiencing. And with
So I find that fascinating, and I'd like to push on it more, but we have about 8 minutes left,
yeah,
and I thought that maybe we could move into something a little bit more practical in the sense of every day.
yeah,
One of the things that I think about is, as you read the news, as you find out facts in the world, as you consume media, how do you make decisions? Because you touched on, developing, for somebody who has been trained in academia and grew up in academia like me, um, this is there's almost no other way of being, right? Like, you mentioned, is this opinion, is this fact, what are your data sources, and how well validated it is, and how many times this has been tried. There's a whole journey that and by the way, this is all, a ton of blind spots. It's not the only way, it's just one
yes,
way, right? But when it comes to your, you know, I've just saw Google's latest movie engine VO3, and it's amazing, what it can do. And before that, it was, Hedra, the fund that was funded by, I think, A16Z, and
hmm,
also amazing. And before that, there was another one. So I've seen, like, in the span of a year, five that every one sort of takes it to the next level, and you can, it's it's harder and harder to tell, and the voices, those are certainly there beyond what we can do.
incredible.
And so when it comes to, you can manufacture text, you can manufacture visuals, you can manufacture sound. What are your practical steps that you use
Yeah,
to figure out, there's a conflict somewhere in the world, or there's some reporting, and you see a few images, or just text. How do you navigate that?
this is a great question. I think the only way to do it is to believe the counterfactual might be true as well. That you start with that point. Like you start with everything you see as saying that's probably not true. It might be true. It's probably not true. Now, if I have an authoritative source of truth who I believe and I trust, typically, like Abel, I trust what you say. We've had lots of discussions. I'm more likely to believe what you say here. That kind of makes sense. Although if I'm working with an AI system, I can't know that because it could have ulterior motives, and a person could as well. Um, but if I can believe the counterfactual might be true, and then I think independent verification. Now, this is where I think that in the near future we we look to refute arguments quickly and to say, look, I've learned something, and once I've heard this claim, seen the video, it looks very true and very real. I look to refute it, and if I can't find an argument that refutes it in a way that feels very substantive, it probably is true. If I find an argument that refutes it in a very substantive way, I now have to do a little more head-to-head work and say, is it internally, does it have internal coherence, right? Does it make sense within its context? Is there enough external collaboration around it? And can I kind of, test it some more and test what's underneath it more than just the headline? So in a movie like Star Wars, if I said, look, this is true, which I just took a movie of Luke Skywalker and this thing, I could say, great, then let's take a look at one of those lightsabers. Oh, we can't show you a lightsaber. Okay, well, can I see like and I can start testing it. And if the tests start failing, I go, that probably isn't true, even though it looks very, very real. I can't actually test it. And I think that these three ideas are important.
That's a great point, because what I heard again, we all filter it through our own plumbing, right? Is the scientific method, right? That essentially you have formed an opinion, right? Then you're gathering evidence,
Yes.
and you're trying to validate this opinion with the data that you have collected.
Yes.
And I'll share with you something that happened to me last week. So, somebody reached out through LinkedIn, and it was a data engineer from Google, and she had a pretty impressive CV. And I'm always looking for talented women because of some outreach programs that I run, and also for learning facilitators and teaching assistants in my courses, right? And so I thought, hey, you have a strong profile, and I have a standard bit of text that I send, are you interested? And I normally send them to a program where they can be interviewed to filter out, those that are not a good fit. And so she responded, and her answer was just a bit off, just enough to me to give me pause. And then I have a former student at Google, and I said, "Oh, talk to my former student, and they can fill you in as to what this is and give you more information." And then there was an excuse, right? I'm not in the San Francisco office, and there was this excusing it, and it didn't take long. It's probably 3 interactions, and I said, okay, this is not true. But in some ways, like you mentioned, I formed this opinion. Okay, yeah, she's a Google engineer, and she looks like she has good background, she can contribute to my team. Okay, and first step. But then I'm gathering more data, and then by the third interaction, I've made the conclusion, okay, this is not true.
Exactly.
And
It's
I
funny.
think,
Eric
go
Van
ahead.
Newt wrote something here. I said to start with the assumption that everything is probably not true is good, a trick, but also sadly cynical. And just to respond to Eric, I don't think it has to be cynical, because you could hope for something to be true. You could say, this claim seems outrageous, but I really want it to be true. I want this thing to be true. But I'll do my due diligence to make sure I'm not taken in by a charlatan, to make sure this is actually the real thing. Okay, if it is the real thing, then I can still be very excited about it. In fact, Eric, I think it might even make you more excited about it, because if you can say, this is not true, but maybe it is, and I hope it is, and you can find out through that process and be very rigorous with that because you practiced so many times, you may feel very confident that that true thing that you hope was true is actually true, and it makes you probably even love it even more. I think it's this sense of that we have to sharpen our acuity for truth and be able to see things more clearly, the way we could, the way that someone who's talented at listening can hear a note better, if it's off tune or something than someone else. We sharpen our acuity, and so we like it even more. The way that someone who really can hear music can hear a chord that's beautifully in tune even better than someone just hearing the chord. I think that that's actually going to make us happier.
It's interesting that you say that, because the default mode, especially for engineers, is they don't believe anything. Talk
Yeah.
to a marketer that has tried to hire people that are software engineers, and you'll
Yeah.
see, there's even a book written about it, that there's no marketing for software engineers. You got to go about it in a very different way.
Yeah.
But we're, sadly here at the end. I thought at
Yeah.
first, okay, we have too much time, and now I feel we don't have
No,
enough. But do you want to
session two.
give some takeaways, Blade, before we
Yeah,
sign off?
I think that my thinking is that um, that if as we have, I'm going to focus on AI systems
Yeah.
come up, that we want to know if they're true, if what they're giving us is true and useful for us. Um, I think that it's really important that we take a look and we use other ways of thinking about how to analyze those systems, and that we must, as individuals, do this to form our own set of models. And then once the models are well formed, like everything else, like as a child, again, we didn't have object permanence, and then you learn that the object is still there. You can use those models in the future and say, look, I have enough models here. It's kind of like when people get older, they say, nope, I don't trust that because I'm 80 years old. I have 80 years of experience. That's been really good. So I'm going to make this decision very quickly. And you're like, but you don't know enough about. That's why I think people often say, oh, mom and dad, you might be wrong. It turns out mom and dad are often right because they've formed more models over more years. And I think that once you can start laddering up, it will get faster and faster and faster. And you'll get better at it. And you'll be able to understand when that AI is beginning to drift. And as now, when you're young, if you begin to do that with AI systems, you'll become very talented in the next several years to go, yep, that's an AI system trying to trick me.
So I'll go here with the scientific method. And the scientific method is one that there's a variation of that on something called OODA: observe, orient,
Mhm.
decide, and act. The other one that's often referred to is the lean framework, and this is
Yeah.
something similar where you present data, you make a decision, you determine whether this lines up or not. All of these are essentially doing something similar. We make a decision about the market in the world. If you read Eric Rice's Lean Startup book,
Yeah.
he spent 6 months working brutally, 12-hour days for something the market didn't want. And this was, led him to write this book and change his approach on how do you
Yeah.
do things. And so how do we get signals from the world? How do we decide what is true? We can get better at it. It's not that we're not going to get fooled.
Hmm.
So for
Hmm.
example, my wife and I have a secret word that we use in case we are not sure the person on the phone is who they claim to be, right?
Yeah.
Because I've seen enough scenarios like this, right?
Yeah.
But how do you get faster at this? As Blade was saying previously, you can train yourself, and after a while, it just becomes second nature, right? Is this true or not? And try to gather data and try to verify. And so there's a bunch of different frameworks. Ultimately, as you take a position, you gather some data, you determine whether this is true or not. You might need to go a few cycles, but this is it. And so we are at the beginning. It'll become more challenging.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to another one. This was a blast, Blade.
Great fun. Great
Yeah,
fun.
yeah.
Thanks.
So take care, everyone.
Wonderful. See you. Bye.
Bye bye.